Vaxen, the eldest of the Zaltath, stood on the cracked balcony of a ship far older than the nearby stars, staring out at the lifeless world below. His breath was shallow, filled with the weight of centuries of hopelessness. Zaltath Prime, once a vibrant cradle of their civilization, now lay as a desolate wasteland. Where once jungles had stretched across continents and oceans teemed with life, now only dunes of ash and poisoned winds remained. Behind Vaxen, two human representatives shuffled into the chamber, curious and cautiously optimistic. He turned slowly, his gaze lingering on their faces, so young by Zaltath standards, yet brimming with that strange human persistence. Vaxen's four-fingered hands trembled slightly as he folded them behind his back. Humans were their final chance, a desperate gamble for a race teetering on extinction. "Do you understand the magnitude of what we are asking?" Vaxen's voice rasped, as ancient as the ruined world below. "No one has succeeded. Every species that tried to revive our world has failed." Captain Sarah Liang, the human expedition leader, exchanged a glance with Dr. Elias Turner, the lead scientist on the mission. She smiled, a small, confident thing that seemed out of place in the face of the dying elder's despair. "We understand," Sarah replied gently, "but we're not here to fail. We specialize in things that aren't supposed to work." Vaxen's deep-set eyes, glowing faintly in the dim light of the chamber, narrowed in disbelief. How could they still carry hope when even the Zaltath, who had mastered the stars, had surrendered to despair? "You think you can breathe life into death?" Vaxen asked, bitterness threading through his voice. "You do not know the cost." Elias, a wiry man with a streak of gray through his dark hair, gave a chuckle under his breath. "We've got a saying, sir. If it was easy, someone else would have done it by now. Lucky for you, humans don't walk away from hard problems." The negotiations had been brief, largely because there was nothing left to negotiate. The Zaltath had no alternatives, and the humans didn't want payment. They saw the task as a challenge, one worth taking on for the sake of doing what no one else could. By the time the human expedition landed on Zaltath Prime, the alien elders had already resigned themselves to failure. They had seen this story play out before. Other species had tried to heal the planet. Some lasted weeks, others years, but in the end, every attempt had withered under the sheer magnitude of the task. As the human vessels touched down on the desolate surface, their boots kicking up clouds of fine, toxic dust, the elders watched from orbit with silent resignation. "Your task is impossible," Vaxen had warned them before they departed. "We are already dead. You just don't know it yet." Sarah had smiled in response, her eyes gleaming. "Impossible? That's just our warm-up." On the ground, the human team wasted no time. Sarah barked orders and the crew set to work, unloading massive terraforming engines, hulking machines capable of altering atmospheric pressure and catalyzing biological growth. These were not mere prototypes. Humanity had already used similar technology to restore devastated ecosystems on Earth and terraform moons in distant systems. The first step was simple: purge the air. The planet's atmosphere had become a toxic soup over millennia, choking out even the most resilient forms of microbial life. Massive atmospheric scrubbers were deployed, fanning out across the barren landscape. Their filters would break down harmful compounds and release breathable gases in their place. It would take months, but it was a beginning. While the scrubbers roared to life, teams of engineers and biologists began seeding microbial life into the barren soil. The tiny organisms were engineered to consume toxins and excrete nutrients that would make future plant growth possible. In artificial reservoirs dug deep into the planet's crust, algae was introduced, designed to thrive even in low-oxygen environments and kickstart the production of breathable air. The Zaltath, watching from orbit, were stunned by the speed with which the humans worked. The scale of the operation, something they had considered impossible, was merely routine for the human expedition. "We need time," Sarah explained over a transmission to Vaxen. "If we can stabilize the atmosphere, the rest will follow. Terraforming isn't magic, it's just biology and engineering." Months passed. The progress was slow, as expected, but undeniable. The skies, once brown with dust, began to show faint hints of blue on the horizon. Tiny patches of algae clung to the edges of newly formed lakes, their bright green hues stark against the gray landscape. Human machines hummed across the surface, purging toxins and laying the groundwork for larger plant growth. But the Zaltath elders remained unconvinced. "Fleeting successes mean nothing," Vaxen warned during one status meeting. "The rot will always return." Elias sighed, running a hand through his messy hair. "Look, I get it. You've been burned before, but you're going to have to trust us on this. We've done harder things than this before." "You do not understand what it means to lose hope," Vaxen muttered bitterly. Elias's voice grew quiet. "No, Elder, we understand exactly what that means. We just decided not to give up." As the first year passed, the planet began to show signs of transformation. The oxygen levels rose steadily, soil samples revealed increasing fertility, and the algae farms spread across the reservoirs. But progress came at a cost. Several human engineers had fallen ill from exposure to the lingering toxins, and the atmosphere was still far from stable. Despite setbacks, the human team remained relentless. They worked through the nights, fixing broken equipment, tweaking biological algorithms, and testing new methods of soil reclamation. They refused to quit. In orbit, the Zaltath elders watched with growing unease. The impossible was beginning to look possible, and with that possibility came something dangerous: hope. Late one night, Elias sat on a rise overlooking a shallow lake, watching as tiny algae blooms spread across the water's surface. The air was still thin, but he could breathe it now without needing a mask. Sarah joined him, handing him a ration bar. "We've come a long way, huh?" Elias grinned. "Yeah, still feels surreal though. Feels like we're pulling a miracle out of thin air." Sarah shrugged. "It's what we do." They sat in silence for a while, watching the faint stars above the horizon. "You think the Zaltath will ever believe we can pull this off?" Elias asked eventually. Sarah chuckled. "Doesn't matter if they believe in us. What matters is that we believe we can do it. And we will." Elias nodded slowly, the weight of her words settling over him. Belief wasn't something the Zaltath had left, but it was something humanity carried with them, stubbornly, wherever they went. In the distance, the first green shoot broke through the cracked soil, a fragile sprout, the first true plant to grow on Zaltath Prime in over 1,000 years. And for the first time since the project began, Elias allowed himself a small, hopeful smile. They were going to make this work, even if it killed them. The human terraforming teams were nothing if not efficient. Within weeks of setting foot on Zaltath Prime, they had turned the barren landscape into a bustling command center. Mobile laboratories, water purifiers, atmospheric scrubbers, and rows of makeshift greenhouses covered the dusty ground. The air still burned the lungs after prolonged exposure, and the soil was poisoned, but that only gave the humans more reason to work harder. "We've got this," Sarah Liang said to her team during their first official brief. Her voice carried that infectious blend of optimism and certainty that had become a hallmark of human exploration. "It's just a lot of problems in a row, and we solve problems for breakfast." Dr. Elias Turner nodded at her words, but looked at the projections hovering over their shared table with a more cautious eye. The task was enormous. The atmosphere, once rich with nitrogen and oxygen, was now an acidic cocktail of gases. The oceans were long gone, and the planet's soil lacked even the faintest trace of organic matter. It was the worst possible candidate for restoration. Still, Elias cracked a grin. That's exactly why they had been sent. "Right," he said, tapping a section of the holographic map with his finger. "We'll start by stabilizing this eastern basin. Purge the atmosphere there. Drop in some algae farms. Once we see results, we scale up." He turned to a small group of Zaltath observers, who had reluctantly joined the team on the surface. The aliens stood with stiff postures, cloaked in ceremonial garb despite the harsh conditions. Their deep-set, glowing eyes betrayed the weariness of millennia. "You'll see," Elias said with a grin. "We've done worse." The work began in earnest. Massive scrubbers were deployed across the eastern basin, releasing waves of chemical agents that neutralized toxins in the air. Alongside them, drones spread genetically engineered microbes that would begin the delicate process of breaking down harmful compounds in the soil. As the scrubbers roared, a network of human machines dug into the bedrock, creating reservoirs that would soon house the first water reclamation plants. These reservoirs, though artificial, would serve as the seeds of new rivers and lakes, the lifeblood of any ecosystem. Above them, artificial clouds began to form as human weather control systems forced moisture to condense in the atmosphere. When the first droplets of rain fell across the barren landscape, the humans erupted in cheers. It wasn't much, just a light drizzle, but it marked the first rainfall in over 1,000 years. The Zaltath elders, watching from a distance, remained quiet. It was not the first time they had seen such efforts begin, only to fail. "We have seen this before," one elder murmured to Vaxen as they stood on a cliff overlooking the humans' progress. "There will be progress, but the planet will reject it, as it always does." Vaxen said nothing, his gaze fixed on the tiny sprigs of algae beginning to take hold in the water reservoirs. He wanted to believe, but hope was a dangerous thing. Down below, Elias knelt by the edge of the reservoir, watching the algae bloom with quiet satisfaction. The microbes had taken hold quicker than expected, their deep green tendrils spreading beneath the surface. It wasn't much, but it was a start. Sarah crouched beside him, splashing water onto her hand. "We should name it," she said. "First lake on a reborn world. Feels like it needs a name." Elias smirked. "Lake Optimism?" She rolled her eyes. "Too cheesy. Let's keep it simple. Lake One." "Lake One it is," Elias said with a chuckle, before glancing over his shoulder at the Zaltath elders observing from afar. "Think they'll ever loosen up?" Sarah shrugged. "Doesn't matter. They've lost so much, it's probably hard for them to believe in anything, but they'll see." Despite the early successes, the challenges grew. The planet fought back in strange ways. Toxic storms swept across the surface, stirring up ancient poisons buried deep beneath the sands. Equipment malfunctioned, forcing engineers to work double shifts just to keep the machinery operational. Several drones were lost to unforeseen chemical reactions in the soil. To make things worse, the Zaltath's doubt weighed heavily on the crew. Elders muttered predictions of failure, and their cold indifference gnawed at the team's morale. "They expect us to fail," Sarah said grimly one night, standing beside Elias as they reviewed the latest setbacks. "They've already written us off." Elias leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples. "They've lost faith in themselves. Can't really blame them for assuming we'll fail, too." Sarah's gaze was steady. "We just need to work harder." And they did. Each time the planet threw a new problem at them, the humans adjusted. When storms battered the scrubbers, the team built stronger shelters. When soil acidity spiked, they engineered new microbes that could adapt. One by one, they fought the planet's resistance with science, engineering, and sheer stubbornness. After 6 months, the first real breakthrough came. The atmosphere, once too toxic to breathe for more than a few minutes, had stabilized enough for short, maskless exposure. The sky, which had been dull and gray for centuries, began to show faint streaks of blue. Tiny patches of moss and algae sprouted along the reservoir's banks, and the water glistened under artificial sunlight. It was a fragile beginning, but it was life. For the first time in centuries, something green grew on Zaltath Prime. Elias stood at the water's edge, staring at the patch of algae as if it were the most beautiful thing he had ever seen. A deep satisfaction spread through him, and for a moment he allowed himself to imagine what this world might look like in 20 years, maybe even 50. He glanced over at the Zaltath elders, who stood nearby, watching with unreadable expressions. For the first time, they looked uncertain. Despite the progress, some of the Zaltath elders remained skeptical. Vaxen, however, found himself drawn to the human methods. There was something strange, something almost reckless, about their optimism. It wasn't born from ignorance, but from a deep, almost stubborn belief that the world could be remade, no matter how far gone it was. One evening, Vaxen approached Elias as the human scientist monitored the algae growth near Lake One. It was the first time Vaxen had spoken to any of the humans alone. "You work tirelessly," the elder said, his voice low, "even when failure seems inevitable." Elias smiled, not looking up from his instruments. "Yeah, that's kind of our thing." Vaxen tilted his head. "Why do you continue? Even when everything tells you this world is beyond saving?" Elias paused, considering his answer. "Because giving up isn't in our nature," he said simply. "If there's even the slightest chance we can make things better, we take it." The elder stared at him for a long moment, as if trying to understand. Hope was something alien to Vaxen, and yet here it was, woven into the fabric of these humans. As the second year drew to a close, the transformation of Zaltath Prime had become undeniable. The algae blooms spread into rivers and shallow lakes, the atmosphere thickened with oxygen, and tiny organisms began colonizing the soil. The Zaltath elders, once silent in their doubt, now watched with something approaching awe. But the humans knew better than to celebrate too soon. There was still so much work to do, so many ways the planet could push back. Yet, for the first time since the project began, it felt possible, and that was all the humans needed, a spark of possibility. "We're going to make this place live again," Sarah whispered one night, standing at the edge of the reservoir with Elias. The sky above them shimmered with stars, clearer than they had ever seen before, and for the first time in centuries, the dead world of Zaltath Prime dared to hope. The air was no longer poison. The algae fields had expanded across the lakes and rivers, stabilizing oxygen levels and transforming the toxic atmosphere into something breathable, albeit thin. For the first time in centuries, Zaltath Prime was no longer a wasteland devoid of life. Around the new water reservoirs, small green shoots began to sprout, a fragile ecosystem on the brink of rebirth. The human team marveled at their progress. Their machinery, tirelessly churning day and night, had forced life back into the soil. What once seemed impossible was slowly becoming reality. "This is it," Sarah Liang said as she stood at the edge of Lake One. The sun glinted off the water's surface, and the air was cool against her skin. "We're finally getting somewhere." Elias grinned, crouching beside her to scoop a handful of water. "Not bad for a dead world, huh?" Sarah glanced toward the Zaltath elders, who stood silently by the shoreline. Their expressions were hard to read, but something had shifted, a flicker of recognition, as though hope, long extinguished, was now cautiously returning. Progress came quickly. The algae not only survived, it thrived, spreading along the artificial rivers and reservoirs, creating small patches of greenery. The sky, once gray and choked with dust, now shone a pale blue. Machines continued purging the air and enriching the soil, and drone squads worked tirelessly to maintain the fragile balance. But with progress came new challenges. One afternoon, as a group of engineers excavated a new reservoir site in the western basin, they uncovered something unexpected: ancient ruins buried beneath layers of sediment. The Zaltath structures were vast, extending deep into the bedrock, and unlike anything the human team had ever seen. The team initially thought they were mere relics, evidence of a civilization long past. But as they dug deep, they found something strange. Embedded within the walls were machines, intact, still humming faintly with dormant energy. Elias knelt beside one of the strange devices, brushing away centuries of dirt and debris. His heart raced as he studied the intricate patterns etched into the metal. This was no ordinary technology. "Sarah," he called, his voice laced with excitement. "You've got to see this." The discovery of the ancient machines sent ripples through both the human team and the Zaltath elders. Some elders viewed the ruins with reverence, urging the humans to leave them undisturbed. "These machines were sealed for a reason," Vaxen warned one evening. "They are relics of a time best forgotten." But Elias and his team saw something else: opportunity. If these ancient devices were as powerful as they seemed, they could accelerate the terraforming process, transforming Zaltath Prime in a fraction of the expected time. "We can stabilize the entire ecosystem within years, maybe even months," Elias explained to Sarah, excitement flickering in his eyes. "Whatever these machines are, they were designed to work with the environment. It's like they were waiting for us to find them." Sarah tapped her finger against her chin, deep in thought. The alien ruins were a risk, but they also held immense potential. If these devices could help them, they couldn't afford to ignore them. Vaxen stood quietly beside them, watching with weary eyes. "Not all power is meant to be awakened," he muttered, more to himself than to the humans. But the decision had already been made. The human team activated the machines. At first, the results were nothing short of miraculous. Within days of activation, the ancient devices pulsed with energy, spreading warmth and nutrients across the landscape. The atmosphere thickened with oxygen, rivers swelled, and plants took root in the soil. Entire sections of the barren world blossomed with greenery, faster than any of the humans could have anticipated. "It's working," Elias whispered in awe, watching as new life spread across the horizon. For the first time, Zaltath Prime was beginning to look alive. Even the Zaltath elders, once skeptical and bitter, seemed stunned by the sudden transformation. Hope, fragile and hesitant, began to bloom among them. "It is possible," Vaxen murmured, as he gazed out over the landscape. "And yet you have done it." Sarah grinned, clapping Elias on the back. "Told you we'd pull it off." But beneath the surface, something was stirring. As the human team continued to activate more of the ancient machines, strange phenomena began to occur. Energy readings spiked across the planet, and odd electromagnetic disturbances disrupted the humans' equipment. Machines malfunctioned without warning, and drones reported strange seismic tremors deep underground. At first, the humans dismissed the anomalies as side effects of the terraforming process. But then, something far more alarming happened. During a routine survey mission near the western ruins, a drone captured footage of an underground chamber breaking open. The footage showed strange, biomechanical creatures emerging from the darkness, beasts unlike anything recorded in galactic history. They were part machine, part organic, with limbs bristling with strange weapons. Their movements were erratic, almost mindless, as if they were just waking from a long sleep. Elias stared at the footage in disbelief. "What the hell are those?" Vaxen's face went pale. He knew exactly what they were. "The Vesher," Vaxen whispered, his voice trembling with fear. "We sealed them away eons ago, and forgot." The humans exchanged worried glances. This wasn't part of the plan. The Veshar were not merely creatures. They were an ancient enemy, a force of destruction that had once ravaged entire star systems. The Zaltath had fought them long ago, barely managing to contain them beneath the surface of their homeworld. The collapse of Zaltath Prime was not a natural disaster. It had been a desperate act of survival. "We didn't know," Vaxen admitted bitterly, "if the Vesher were dead, or merely waiting. Now we know." Sarah's jaw tightened as she stared at the flickering footage of the creatures swarming underground. Their progress on the surface had awakened a nightmare. "We have to contain them," she said firmly, "whatever it takes." But containing the Veshar was easier said than done. More creatures began to stir beneath the ruins, their biomechanical forms growing stronger with every passing hour. The terraforming machines, originally designed to restore life, had also accelerated the Veshar's awakening. The human team scrambled to understand what they were dealing with, poring over ancient Zaltath records. But the logs were fragmented and cryptic, offering little guidance. Elias sat at his terminal, exhaustion heavy in his eyes. "We're missing something. There's got to be a way to stop them." Vaxen stood behind him, his expression grim. "We tried everything. The Vesher cannot be destroyed, only sealed." Sarah's fists clenched at her sides. "We didn't come all this way just to let some ancient monsters undo everything." Elias exhaled slowly, tapping his fingers against the console. There had to be a way forward. They just had to find it before it was too late. The Veshar continued to awaken, and the ground trembled beneath the human base. It was only a matter of time before the creatures reached the surface. Despite the growing danger, the humans refused to abandon their mission. They had brought life back to Zaltath Prime, and they weren't about to let it slip away. Sarah stood before her team, her expression fierce. "We're not giving up, not now." Elias nodded, a determined glint in his eye. "If the Veshar want this world, they're going to have to fight us for it." And just like that, the humans prepared for war. The tremors became stronger, rumbling beneath the surface of Zaltath Prime, like the heartbeat of a sleeping monster. The Veshar were stirring, and it was only a matter of time before they reached the surface. Across the newly formed lakes and fields, human teams worked feverishly, preparing defenses. Sarah Liang stood at the command center's console, eyes locked on the holographic display of seismic activity. Dozens of Veshar hives had activated beneath the planet's surface, spreading like an infection. The ground shook violently every few hours, threatening to undo all the progress they had made. "How long do we have?" she asked. Dr. Elias Turner, hunched over a console with dark circles under his eyes, shook his head grimly. "Best guess? 2 days before the first wave breaches the surface. Maybe less if they get creative." Vaxen stood silently in the corner, his ancient gaze fixed on the display. "We tried to destroy them once," he murmured, "but they are not merely creatures. They are a force of entropy. Left unchecked, they will consume everything, just as they did before." Elias slammed his fist on the console. "So we fight. We've got weapons, we've got machines. Hell, we'll use the terraforming engines if we have to." Vaxine's expression darkened. "It won't be enough." The Veshar were unlike anything the humans had ever encountered. They weren't simply soldiers. They were adaptive hunters. Part machine, part organism. They could assimilate organic and technological material, constantly evolving to become more lethal. Their presence was a virus, one that grew stronger with every failed attempt to resist. The worst part? They couldn't be permanently killed. When defeated, the Veshar would reconstitute themselves, scavenging whatever they could find to rebuild their forms. It was how they had brought down the Zaltath civilization eons ago, by slowly wearing them down, wave after relentless wave. The humans understood now. This wasn't a battle they could win with brute force. They needed a plan. Elias gathered his team in the command tent. The room was packed with tired engineers, scientists, and soldiers, all grappling with the enormity of what they were facing. "We're not here to play defense," Sarah began, addressing the room. "We've come too far to give up now." She jabbed a finger at the map hovering over the table. "If the Veshar breach the surface, they'll swarm everything we've built. Our only option is to push back before they emerge." A soldier named Jackson grunted. "How are we supposed to fight underground? We don't even know where they all are." "We don't need to fight them all," Elias replied, tapping the hologram to highlight a series of tunnels beneath one of the largest hives. "The ancient Zaltath machines we found, they weren't just terraforming tech, they were part of the containment system. If we can reactivate the right devices, we can trigger a seismic collapse and seal the hives for good." The room fell silent for a moment, as the implications sank in. "And if it doesn't work?" Jackson asked quietly. "Then we die trying," Sarah answered, her voice hard and unwavering. "We save this planet or we go down with it. No in between." The plan was simple in theory, but execution would be anything but. The team would need to descend into the underground tunnels, find the core control nodes of the ancient containment system, and reactivate, all while the Veshar stirred around them, waiting to strike. Sarah and Elias volunteered to lead the mission, along with a small squad of engineers and soldiers. The Zaltath elders offered no help. They believed the Veshar could not be defeated, and that fighting them was only delaying the inevitable. As the team gathered their gear, Elias noticed Vaxen lingering nearby, silent but watchful. "Something you want to say, Elder?" Elias asked. Vaxen's expression was unreadable. "I have seen many battles," he said quietly, "but none fought with such foolish hope." Elias smirked. "Yeah, well, humans have a talent for doing the impossible. You'll see." The team descended into the tunnels at dawn, armed with a mix of human and repurposed Zaltath technology. The underground passages were dark, narrow, and eerily quiet. The only sound was the hum of the ancient machines buried deep within the walls. Elias and Sarah led the way, their weapons drawn, while drones scouted ahead. The deeper they went, the more unsettling the atmosphere became. The walls pulsed faintly, as if alive, and strange symbols glowed dimly beneath layers of dust. "This place is a tomb," Jackson muttered, glancing nervously around. Elias nodded grimly. "Yeah, and we're walking right into the heart of it." As they neared the first control node, the Veshar struck. The creatures came out of nowhere, slithering from cracks in the walls, bursting from hidden alcoves, and swarming the team with terrifying speed. Their metallic limbs clattered against the stone, and their biomechanical eyes glowed with an eerie, predatory light. "Contact!" Sarah shouted, opening fire. The air filled with the deafening roar of gunfire and the shriek of the Veshar. The creatures moved with unsettling precision, dodging and adapting to every attack. For every one they destroyed, another took its place, faster, stronger, more lethal. "Fall back!" Elias yelled, throwing a grenade into the swarm. The explosion tore through the creatures, scattering them, but even as the smoke cleared, the remnants began to reassemble. "This isn't sustainable!" Jackson shouted, firing wildly. They just keep coming! But the team pressed on. They fought their way through the tunnels, inch by bloody inch, until they reached the first control node. The ancient machinery hummed to life as Elias worked frantically to reactivate it, sweat pouring down his face. Come on, he muttered, his fingers flying over the controls. The walls trembled violently as the Vesher closed in. How much longer? Sarah demanded, covering him with her rifle. Almost there, Elias shouted. Just hold them off. The Vesher surged forward in one final desperate wave. The team was running out of time. Jackson fell, dragged down by a swarm of creatures, but Sarah didn't hesitate. She fought her way to him, pulling him free with sheer determination. Nobody gets left behind, she growled, firing into the horde. At that moment, the control node activated. A low, resonant hum echoed through the tunnels as ancient mechanisms rumbled to life. Got it! Elias shouted triumphantly. The collapse is starting! The ground beneath them shifted as the ancient containment system began to seal the hives. Massive stone slabs slid into place, trapping the Vesher within. Move! Move! Sarah ordered, dragging Jackson to his feet. The team sprinted through the collapsing tunnels, dodging falling debris and swarming Veshar. They burst back onto the surface, just as the final tunnel entrance sealed behind them with a thunderous boom. The Veshar were contained once more, buried deep beneath Zaltath Prime, where they could no longer threaten the surface. The team collapsed on the ground, gasping for breath. They had done it. Against all odds, they had fought back the ancient enemy and sealed the hives. Vaxen approached them slowly, his expression one of cautious disbelief. You survived, he murmured, as if unable to believe it. Sarah grinned, wiping blood from her brow. Told you, we don't quit. Vaxen stared at her for a long moment, then nodded. For the first time in centuries, hope flickered in his ancient eyes, and for the first time, he believed. The ground lay still beneath the twilight sky. The hives were sealed, the Vesher buried once more beneath the planet's surface. The battle was over, but the cost weighed heavily on the survivors. Human engineers and soldiers sat slumped against rocks, catching their breath and tending to the wounded. The newly reborn Zaltath Prime remained intact, but it was a fragile victory. Sarah Liang stood at the edge of the battlefield, looking out over the wreckage of the ruined tunnels. They had done the impossible, again, but it hadn't come without sacrifice. Several of their people lay silent, and countless others were battered and broken from the fight. Elias Turner limped over, clutching a makeshift bandage on his arm. He gave her a weary grin. Well, we didn't die. That's a plus, Sarah snorted, half laughing despite herself. Not yet. Anyway, the Zaltath elders watched in silence. They had seen many battles over their long lives, but this was different. These humans had fought not for power or conquest, but simply because they refused to give up. They had risked everything against all odds, not just to save themselves, but to restore a world that wasn't even their own. Vaxen stood among the elders, his ancient features unreadable. But as he gazed at the humans, still standing, still breathing, something inside him shifted. For the first time in centuries, he allowed himself to believe that his people might have a future after all. You fought when there was no reason to, Vaxen said softly, approaching Sarah and Elias. Why? What made you stay? Elias wiped dirt from his face and gave the elder a tired smile. It's just who we are. We finish what we start. Vaxen studied them for a moment longer, then inclined his head in a gesture of respect. We owe you more than we can say. The next few days were spent stabilizing the planet's ecosystem and assessing the damage caused by the Vesher's brief awakening. The hives remained sealed, the ancient machines once again locked away beneath the planet's surface. But the memory of what had nearly been unleashed weighed heavily on everyone. As the human team continued their work, the first alien plants began to sprout across the landscape. Tiny vines curled along the banks of artificial rivers, and trees, grown from seeds preserved in ancient Zaltath vaults, took root in the newly fertile soil. Life was returning. One evening, as the sun set over Lake One, the humans and Zaltath gathered together for the first time. It was a quiet celebration, nothing extravagant, just a shared moment of reflection. The Zaltath elders stood at the water's edge, watching the new ecosystem bloom under the fading light. Sarah raised a glass of water, a small smile playing on her lips. To a new beginning. Elias followed suit, raising his own glass. And to doing the impossible. Vaxen, standing among his people, gave a small, rare smile. And to those who refused to give up. As the days stretched into weeks, the humans began to prepare for their departure. The restoration process would take years, maybe decades, but the hardest part, the impossible part, was already behind them. The planet would live again, and the Zaltath would have the tools they needed to rebuild their civilization. On the final day, Vaxen approached Sarah and Elias one last time. The ancient bitterness that had weighed him down for centuries was gone, replaced by something gentler, something like hope. You have given us more than a planet, Vaxen said quietly. You have given us a chance to believe again. Sarah placed a hand on the elder's shoulder. Just don't waste it, she said softly. Vaxen nodded. We won't. As the human ships lifted off from Zaltath Prime. The crew watched through the windows as the planet shrank beneath them. It was still a long way from being fully restored, but the green patches across its surface were a promise, a sign that life would grow again. Elias stood beside Sarah, arms crossed as he gazed at the world below. "Think they'll be okay?" he asked. Sarah smiled faintly. "They'll have to be. We gave them the tools. Now it's up to them." Elias chuckled. "Well, if nothing else, we proved them wrong. They thought it was impossible. And here we are." In the silence of space, the human fleet drifted toward the stars, leaving Zaltath Prime behind. But they didn't leave empty-handed. Among the ruins, they had uncovered something far more valuable than ancient technology or lost knowledge, a connection. The Zaltath had once believed themselves to be alone in the galaxy, isolated by their failure and loss. But through the stubborn determination of a species that refused to quit, they found hope again. And in doing so, humanity had proven once more that nothing, no matter how broken, was truly beyond saving. As the ship's engines hummed quiet, Sarah leaned back in her seat and glanced at Elias. "Think anyone back home will believe this story?" Elias grinned. "Probably not, but that's never stopped us before." Sarah laughed, the sound light and full of promise. "Good thing we don't need anyone to believe. We just need to keep going." And with that, the ship vanished into the stars, leaving behind a world reborn, a testament to the power of persistence, of hope, and of the indomitable human spirit. In the years to come, Zaltath Prime would flourish, and the Veshar would remain sealed beneath its surface, a warning of the dangers buried in the past. But the story of its revival would live on, a story of impossible odds, of ancient enemies, and of the humans who, against all logic, had made the impossible happen, because that's what humans do. They survive, they rebuild, and when no one else believes it can be done, they do it anyway.